The explosion came without warning. A Velen military outpost on the border of the Outer Territories was hit by 3 missiles in the middle of the night cycle. 200 soldiers died. The outpost was reduced to burning metal and floating debris. By morning, every screen in the palace was showing the footage, and the War Council had already been called. Yuna stood in the council chamber with her arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. 12 Velen generals sat around a massive stone table, their voices rising over each other like waves crashing against rocks. Her father, Emperor Gaiol, sat at the head of the table, silent and still, his iron-gray face unreadable. And beside him, standing with his arms folded and his golden armor gleaming, was Prince Hanyul. "This is the humans' doing," Hanyul said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The room fell quiet. "They sign a peace treaty with one hand and arm our enemies with the other. This attack bears the mark of Reshan weapons, and we all know who sells weapons to the Reshan." "That is not confirmed," one of the generals said carefully. "It does not need to be confirmed," Hanyul snapped. "The timing speaks for itself. The humans come to our door with smiles and marriage offers, and the moment we lower our guard, our borders burn." He turned to face his father. "End this alliance, send the human back to his republic, and let us deal with the Reshan the way Velens have always dealt with threats." Several generals murmured in agreement. Emperor Gaiol said nothing. He simply stared at the destruction on the screen, his ancient eyes heavy with thought. The doors of the council chamber opened. Every head turned. Dohwan walked in, alone, without armor, without weapons, wearing the simple dark clothes he always wore. He looked absurdly small in that room full of giants. A servant tried to stop him at the door, but he had already passed. "This is a closed council," Hanyul said, his voice dangerous. "I know," Dohwan said. He did not stop walking until he reached the table. He placed a thin data tablet on the surface and pushed it toward the center. "I also know who attacked your outpost, and it was not the Human Republic." The silence that followed was the kind that could cut skin. "Speak," Emperor Gale said. It was the first word he had spoken in an hour. Dohwan activated the tablet. A holographic display rose from its surface, showing trade routes, supply lines, communication logs, and financial records. He began to explain, and his voice was calm and measured, like a teacher addressing a class. The rebels who attacked the outpost were not Reshan, a faction from the Outer Territories, discontented with the Empire's expansion policies, funded by mineral wealth from 3 mining colonies that had been reporting false output numbers for over a year. The weapons they used were Reshan-made, yes, but they had been purchased through a black market channel that ran through a neutral station. Dohwan traced the money, he traced the communications. He showed the council, step by step, how the rebellion had been built in plain sight, using information that was already available in the Empire's own public trade archives. "I did not hack your systems," he said, before anyone could accuse him. "I did not spy on your military. Everything I used is in your own records. I simply read what your intelligence officers did not." The room was completely still. 12 generals stared at the holographic display with expressions that moved from shock to embarrassment to grudging respect. Emperor Geul leaned forward in his chair, his eyes sharp and alive in a way Yuna had not seen in years. Hanul's face was white with fury. "You dare," he said softly, "you dare walk into a Velen War Council and lecture us about our own empire." Dohwan looked at him. There was no fear in his eyes, no anger either, just the same steady calm that he carried with him everywhere, like a coat he never took off. "I dare," he said, "because my wife's empire is under threat, and I would rather be rude than silent while the wrong people are blamed." Nobody spoke. Hanul opened his mouth, closed it, and sat down. Emperor Gaewol looked at Dohan for a long moment, and something passed between them that Yuna could not name. Then the Emperor turned to his generals and said, "Investigate the mining colonies. Follow the money, and someone get this man a chair." Dohan sat at the table the entire time, answering questions, offering analysis, and quietly correcting assumptions. He did not raise his voice once. By the end, 2 generals had personally thanked him, and one had offered him a drink of Velen battle wine, which was the closest thing to a compliment a Velen soldier could give. But the day was not over. 3 days later, Yuna was giving a public address at a gathering in the palace courtyard. It was a routine event, meant to reassure the court that the empire was strong and stable. Dohan stood nearby, as he always did at public functions, quiet and unnoticed. The shot came from a balcony above. A beam of hot light cut through the air and struck the stone wall inches from Yuna's head. The crowd screamed. Guards drew weapons. Chaos erupted in every direction. Dohan moved. He did not fight. He grabbed Yuna's arm and pulled her behind a stone pillar with a speed that shocked her. His grip was not strong by Velen standards, but it was precise, hitting the exact point on her arm that would make her body follow without resistance. It was a trained motion, something practiced 10,000 times until it lived in the muscles. "Balcony," he said, his voice flat and focused. "Second level, 40 degrees left, single shooter." Taesun, who had been 3 steps behind, heard every word. He raised his weapon, sighted, and fired. The shooter dropped. 4 seconds. The entire thing had taken 4 seconds. The courtyard fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the sound of guards rushing toward the balcony. Yuna leaned against the pillar, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Dohan stood in front of her, his body between her and the open space, his eyes still scanning the balcony, the rooftops, every window. "It is clear," he said after a moment. "One shooter, no support team, likely a hired hand, not a trained operative. The angle was wrong for a professional." Yuna grabbed his shoulder and turned him to face her. "You moved before my own guards did," she said. "How?" Dohan looked at her. For a moment, the calm mask slipped, and she saw something underneath. Not fear, something older and heavier. Weariness. The weariness of a man who had been in danger so many times that his body reacted before his mind could think. He rolled up his sleeve. His forearm was covered in scars, burn marks, long healed, a jagged line where something sharp had cut deep, a patch of skin that was too smooth, the kind that came from medical reconstruction after serious damage. "I was a Marine before I was a diplomat," he said quietly. "I served on 3 different worlds during the border conflicts. I have been shot, burned, and buried alive under rubble for 11 hours on a moon whose name I cannot even pronounce." He paused. "I did not come here to be fragile, Yuna. I came here to build something worth surviving for." She stared at his scars. She had seen scars before, on Velen warriors who wore them with pride, and told their stories at every feast. But Dohan had hidden his. He had carried them in silence, under his sleeves, where no one would see. He had never mentioned them. He had never used them to prove his worth. Something shifted inside her chest. It was not pity. It was not amusement or curiosity. It was respect, real and heavy, settling into her bones like a stone dropped into deep water. She looked into his dark, steady eyes and realized, with a kind of shock that took her breath away, that she had been wrong about him from the very first moment. He was not fragile. He had never been fragile. He was simply the kind of strong that did not need to announce itself. Everything changed between them after that day in the courtyard. Not suddenly, not with dramatic words or grand gestures, but slowly, the way dawn comes after a long night. Yuna stopped watching Dohan from a distance. She started sitting with him, talking with him, and for the first time, listening. They met each evening in a small room near the palace library. Do-hwan would bring his notes, pages covered in his tiny, careful handwriting. And Yuna would bring what she knew about the court, the military, and her brother. Together they began to build a picture, and the picture was ugly. Hanul is not just angry about the alliance, Do-hwan said one evening, spreading a map of the outer territories across the table. He has been meeting with the border lords in private. 3 of them visited the palace in the last month, and none of those visits appear in the official records. Yuna frowned. How do you know this? The servants talk, Do-hwan said. The cooks know who eats in the private dining rooms. The cleaners know which guest chambers are prepared. People notice things when they feel invisible. And I have made it my business to make sure they do not feel invisible around me. She stared at him. It was such a simple thing, and yet no one else in the palace had thought to do it. The nobles ignored the servants. The generals ignored the cooks. But Do-hwan had spent weeks drinking tea with them, asking about their families, learning their names. And in return, they told him everything. You think Hanul is planning something, she said. I think Hanul is planning a coup, he said, and his voice was very quiet. And I think the border rebellion is not separate from him. I think he is funding it, or at the very least allowing it to grow, because chaos gives him the excuse he needs to seize power from your father. She wanted to say that her brother was arrogant and cruel, but not a traitor. But she could not, because everything Do-hwan had shown her fit together too perfectly, like pieces of a machine clicking into place. What do we do? She asked. It was the first time she had ever said we, and meant it. Do-hwan looked at her and something warm moved through his dark eyes. We prepare, he said, and we do it quietly. They had 2 weeks. It was not enough. Hanul moved faster than either of them expected. He struck on a night when the palace was hosting a celebration for the harvest festival. The halls were full of music and light. The guards were relaxed. Emperor Gale was in his private chambers, resting between events. The first sign of trouble was the lights going out. Not all of them, just enough. The corridors leading to the Emperor's chambers went dark. The communication systems in the central palace tower went silent. And the guards stationed at every entrance were quietly replaced by soldiers wearing the crest of Prince Hanul. Yuna was in the great hall when it happened. She felt the change before she saw it. The music stopped. The laughter faded. And then the doors opened, and Hanul walked in, wearing full battle armor with 200 soldiers behind him. The Emperor is unwell, Hanul announced to the frozen crowd. I am assuming temporary command of the Empire, for the safety of all. It was a lie, and everyone knew it was a lie, but no one moved. The soldiers behind Hanul carried weapons that could cut through stone, and the nobles in the hall carried nothing but wine glasses. Yuna reached for the blade at her side, but a hand touched her arm. Do-hwan. He had appeared beside her so quietly she had not noticed. Not here, he whispered. Not now. Come with me. She wanted to fight. Every part of her body screamed at her to draw her weapon and charge her brother. But she looked into Do-hwan's eyes and saw something there that stopped her. Not fear, certainty. The certainty of a man who had been in situations like this before and knew exactly what the next 10 minutes needed to look like. She followed him. They moved through the palace using service corridors that Do-hwan had mapped in his first week. Narrow passages used by servants to carry food and supplies, too small for Velen soldiers in full armor to move through quickly. Do-hwan led the way, moving with a calm speed that Yuna struggled to match in the tight spaces. He knew every turn, every door, every hidden staircase. You memorized all of this, she said, half in disbelief. I memorize every building I enter, he said. It is an old habit from the Marines. Always know your exits. They reached a junction where Taesun was waiting with Boyoung, who had stayed at the palace after her trade delegation ended. Boyoung had a toolkit slung over her shoulder and a fierce look on her face. Hanel has locked down the main communication array, Boyoung said. No signals in or out of the palace. Can you break it open? Doan asked. I can do better. I can reroute through the engine room of the docked trade ship. It will take time, but I can broadcast on all Imperial channels. Do it, Doan said. He turned to Taesun. Gather anyone loyal, servants, minor nobles, anyone who will not bend to Hanel. Bring them to the lower kitchens. And what will you do? Taesun asked. Doan smiled. It was a thin, tired smile, but it was real. I will do what I always do. I will think. Over the next 3 hours, Doan organized a resistance from inside the palace walls. He did not use weapons. He did not command soldiers. Instead, he used the servants, the people Hanel had never bothered to notice, to sabotage the coup from the inside. Doors were locked from service panels. Power was cut to specific corridors, forcing Hanel soldiers to stumble through darkness. False alarms were triggered in empty sections of the palace, pulling squads away from critical locations. The palace's own systems, designed to protect the emperor, were turned against the usurper by the very people who maintained them every day. Yuna fought her way toward her father's chambers. She cut through 7 of Hanel's soldiers on the way, her blades singing through the air, her body moving with the fury and precision of a lifetime of training. But one of them got lucky. A blade caught her side, cutting through a gap in her armor. She stumbled, and blood, bright silver vellon blood, poured down her leg. She reached the corridor outside her father's door and found it blocked by a squad of soldiers. She killed 2. The 3rd knocked her blade away. The 4th struck her across the face, and she went down. And then, Dohan was there. He came out of the service corridor like a shadow. He was not carrying a weapon. He was carrying a fire suppression canister from the wall, and he slammed it into the back of the nearest soldier's knee with enough force to bring the giant vellon crashing down. In the confusion, Taesun appeared from the other direction and took out the remaining soldiers with precise, brutal efficiency. Dohan knelt beside Yuna, his hands pressed against her wound, and she could feel them shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding something so much larger and heavier than himself. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I can fight," she said. "I asked if you can walk. Fighting can wait." She leaned on him, and she could feel his body straining under her weight, his legs trembling, his breath coming hard. He was carrying a Velen princess through a war zone, and he was doing it through sheer willpower. "Why?" she asked, her vision blurring. "You could have left. The Republic would take you back." Dovan looked at her. His face was pale and covered in sweat, but his eyes were steady. "Because you are my wife," he said, "and where I come from, that means something." They reached a safe room. Bo Young's broadcast went live 20 minutes later, sent on every Imperial channel, reaching every ship, every outpost, every colony in the Velen Empire. It was not a battle cry. It was Dohwan's voice, calm and clear, reading a prepared statement that laid out Hainul's treachery with evidence, names, dates, and financial records. It was undeniable. It was devastating. Within 2 hours, the fleet commanders who had been waiting for orders turned their ships toward the palace. Not to support Hanul, to arrest him. By dawn, it was over. Hanul was in chains. Emperor Gale was freed, bruised but alive. And Dohan sat on the floor of the safe room, with Yuna's blood on his hands, too exhausted to stand. The Emperor found them there. He looked at the small human man sitting on the floor of his palace, surrounded by the wreckage of a coup he had dismantled with nothing but his mind and his courage. "I sent you here to be a leash," Emperor Gale said. "Instead, you became a pillar." Dohan looked up at him with tired eyes. "I would rather be a bridge," he said, "if you will let me." The emperor stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked away. Yuna, leaning against the wall with bandages wrapped around her side, watched her husband close his eyes and rest his head against the cold stone. He was bruised. He was shaking. He was the smallest person in the room, and he was the reason the empire still stood. The palace was quiet in the days after the coup, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the world is still deciding what shape it wants to take next. Workers repaired the damage to the walls and corridors. Servants swept away the broken glass and scorched metal. The court moved slowly, carefully, like a body recovering from a wound, testing each step before putting its full weight down. Do-won spent the first 3 days in the medical wing, not because he was badly hurt, but because Yuna ordered him to rest, and he discovered very quickly that arguing with a Velen princess who had nearly died beside you was not a fight he could win. His injuries were small by Velen standards. Bruised ribs, a sprained wrist, exhaustion deep enough to make his hands tremble when he lifted a cup. But the Velen healers treated him with a care and attention that surprised him. One of them, an old woman with gentle hands and silver eyes, told him quietly that her grandson had been one of the loyal servants who helped lock the doors during the coup. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. The care in her hands said it for her. Yuna visited him every day. She sat beside his bed and talked, sometimes about the recovery effort, sometimes about politics, and sometimes about nothing at all. She brought him books from the palace library and fruit from the kitchens, the mild kind that Aura now kept in a special basket marked with his name. They talked about small things, and in those small things, something large and quiet grew between them. On the 4th day, Do-hwan was released from the medical wing, and the court was summoned for a formal address. The great hall was full again, but the feeling was different now. The nobles who had once whispered and laughed at the sight of a human in their palace stood in respectful silence. The generals, who had dismissed him as a decoration, nodded as he passed. The servants, standing along the walls as they always did, watched him with something that looked very much like pride. Do-won walked into the hall beside Yuna. Not behind her, beside her. And for the first time, no one in the room found that strange. Emperor Gaal stood before his throne, his massive body still bearing the marks of his captivity, bruises across his face and wrists rubbed raw from restraints. But his voice was strong, and his presence filled the hall the way it always had, like gravity itself bending around him. "The Empire stands," he said, "not because of our ships or our soldiers or our strength. It stands because, in our darkest hour, the truth was spoken clearly enough for all to hear. And it was spoken by a man who owes us nothing." He turned to Do-won. "The court wishes to honor you. I am prepared to grant you the title of War Commander, with all the rights and privileges that come with it." The hall murmured. A military title was the highest honor a Velen could receive. For it to be offered to a human was unheard of. Do-won bowed his head. "I am grateful, Emperor, but I must decline." The murmuring stopped. Gale raised an eyebrow. "You refuse?" "I do not want a title of war," Do-won said. "What I want is something else." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried through the silent hall with a clarity that needed no volume. "I would like to propose a cultural exchange program. Human teachers in Velen schools, Velen scholars in human universities, our children learning from each other, not learning to fear each other." He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of nobles and generals and servants alike. "Swords won your empire," he said. "Understanding will keep it." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Emperor Gale let out a sound that Yuna had not heard from her father in years. He laughed, It was a deep rumbling sound, like distant thunder, and it rolled through the hall and loosened something tight in the air. "You are a strange creature, Doan," the Emperor said. "But you are not wrong." He nodded. "You shall have your program." The hall erupted. Not in the polite, measured applause of the first day. This was real, loud and rough, and full of feeling. Yuna stood beside Doan and clapped with them, and she felt something warm spreading through her chest that she had never felt before in this hall. Hope. Later that week, Yuna went to visit Haniel in his cell. She did not know what she expected to find. Her brother sat on a stone bench in a room with no windows, his golden armor stripped away, his silver skin dull in the dim light. He looked smaller than she remembered. When she entered, he did not stand. "Have you come to lecture me?" he asked. "No," she said. "I came to see you." They sat in silence for a while. Then Haniel said, "Send the human in." Yuna hesitated, then left and returned with Dohan. He entered the cell quietly and sat down across from Haniel. The two men looked at each other, one massive, broken, and bitter, the other small, calm, and whole. "How?" Haniel asked. There was no anger left in his voice, just emptiness. "You are small. You are weak. Your bones would snap in my hands. How did you beat me?" Dohan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You measured strength by what you could destroy. I measured it by what I could hold together." Haniel stared at him. Then he turned his face to the wall and said nothing more. Dohan stood, bowed slightly out of a respect that Haniel probably did not deserve, and left the cell. She caught his arm and turned him to face her. "Did you mean that?" she asked. "What you said to him?" "I meant every word." "Is that really how humans see strength?" Dohan thought about it. "Not all of us," he said, "but the best of us, yes. We are small, Yuna. We are soft. We break easily and heal slowly. We cannot outfight a Valen, or outrun a Reshan, or outlast a dozen other species in the galaxy. But we hold on. That is what we do. We hold on to things, to people, to ideas, to hope, even when everything around us says we should let go. And sometimes, holding on is the hardest thing in the universe." That evening, they stood together on the palace balcony. The Valen homeworld stretched out below them, a landscape of dark mountains and silver rivers, and cities that glowed like scattered jewels in the fading light. The sky was a deep purple, streaked with the light of 3 distant moons, and the air was cold and clean, and smelled of stone and rain. Yuna leaned against the railing and looked at Doan. He was gazing out at the world below with the expression he always wore when he was thinking, quiet and open and endlessly curious. The wind moved through his dark hair, and his scarred hands rested lightly on the stone railing. "I owe you an apology," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "When I first saw you, I pitied you. I thought you were something fragile that I would have to protect, something breakable that my father had sent me to watch over. I was wrong, and I am sorry." Doan smiled. It was the same warm, quiet smile she had seen on the first day, when he had bowed before her in the great hall, and spoken her name in her own language. But now she understood what it meant. It was not the smile of a man trying to impress. It was the smile of a man who was simply glad to be there. "I was terrified on my first day here," he said. "I want you to know that. I was not brave. I was not confident. I walked into that hall and my hands were shaking so badly I had to press them against my legs to keep anyone from seeing." "You did not look afraid, because fear and courage are not opposites, Yuna. Fear is the weight. Courage is carrying it anyway. I was afraid every single day, but I decided to show up anyway. That is all strength ever is, showing up when it would be easier not to." She reached out and took his hand. His hand was small in hers, his fingers thin and rough with calluses and scars. She could feel his pulse through his skin, quick and light, the heartbeat of a creature who burned bright and fast and refused to go out. She did not feel like she was holding something fragile. She felt like she was standing beside something unbreakable. They stood together on the balcony as the light faded and the stars came out, one by one, filling the sky with the ancient light of a galaxy that was older than either of their peoples. And Yuna thought about everything she had been taught, every lesson about power and dominance and the right of the strong to rule the weak. And then she thought about the man beside her, the man who had walked into a hall of giants with shaking hands and a borrowed phrase in a language not his own, the man who had read books and made friends with cooks and memorized corridors and never once raised his voice, the man who had carried her through a war with nothing but his will and his mind and his stubborn, unshakable refusal to give up. The galaxy had taught her that power was in the fist, in the blade, in the roar of warships tearing through the dark. But this quiet man from a small blue world had shown her the truth. The strongest thing in the universe was not the force that could shatter mountains. It was the soul that could bend and bend and bend and never break. She held his hand tighter, and he held hers back. And in the silence of that balcony, high above a world that was only just beginning to understand what humans truly were, a princess and a marine stood side by side and watched the stars. The great hall of the Velen Imperial flagship was built to make visitors feel small. The ceiling rose so high that clouds of cold mist gathered near the top. The pillars were carved from black stone, each one wider than a house. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, and the light came from floating orbs that drifted slowly through the air like tiny moons. Hundreds of Velen nobles stood in rows along the hall, dressed in armor and silk, their silver skin catching the light. They were tall, the shortest among them standing nearly 7 feet, and their bodies were thick with muscle, built over generations on a heavy-gravity world. They looked like statues carved by someone who believed beauty and danger were the same thing. Princess Yuna stood at the far end of the hall, beside her father's throne. She wore ceremonial armor of deep blue metal, and her long white hair was braided with threads of gold. Her eyes, pale violet and sharp as glass, watched the doors at the other end of the hall. Today was the day she would meet the man she was supposed to marry. A human. She had seen pictures, of course. She had read the files. But pictures and files were not the same as seeing one in the flesh. The doors opened. The human delegation walked in, and the hall went quiet. Not the respectful quiet of admiration, the quiet of disappointment. There were 6 of them. They wore dark formal uniforms, neat and simple. They walked with straight backs and steady steps. But beside the towering Velens on either side, they looked like children visiting a temple. The tallest among them barely reached the chest of the nearest courtier. Yuna's eyes moved across the group and found him. Doan, her future husband. He walked in the center of the group, one step ahead of the others. He was lean, with a calm face and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without reacting to anything. His hair was black and cut short. He was not ugly, she thought, but he was so painfully ordinary. No claws, no armor on his skin, no visible strength in his thin arms. He looked like something she could break with one careless gesture. A courtier near her whispered, "Is that him, the one they are giving us?" Another whispered back, "They must not value this alliance very much." Yuna said nothing. She kept her face still and her posture straight, the way her father had taught her. But inside, she felt a heavy sinking feeling. She had known this would be a political marriage. She had accepted that. But some small, foolish part of her had hoped the humans would send someone impressive. Someone who would at least make the court stop laughing. The delegation stopped at the base of the throne platform. The human at the front, a woman with sharp features and gray in her hair, bowed and spoke the formal greeting in the common galactic tongue. Then Dowan stepped forward. He bowed. Not the stiff, nervous bow Yuna had expected. It was slow and steady, with his eyes lowered, performed with a kind of quiet dignity that surprised her. And then he spoke. Galtha Vereen, Sunara Yuna. The hall went completely silent. He had spoken in Velen. The pronunciation was rough, the accent thick and strange, but the words were correct. It was a formal greeting of respect, the kind used between equals. No off-worlder had ever bothered to learn even a single word of their language. Most species considered it too complex, too old, too unimportant, now that the common tongue existed. Yuna stared at him. For a long moment she did not know what to say. Then she recovered and replied in the common tongue. You are welcome to the court of the Velen Empire. It was a small, warm smile, and it reached his eyes. Yuna looked away from it, unsure why it bothered her. Emperor Geul rose from his throne. He was ancient even by Velen standards. His silver skin darkened to iron gray. His body still enormous, but slower now, heavier. His voice, however, was as strong as a warship engine. The alliance is sealed today, he said, addressing the hall. Let no one say the Velen Empire does not honor its word. The human republic has offered peace, and we have accepted. This marriage will bind our peoples. The court applauded. It was polite, measured, and completely without warmth. Yuna clapped along with them, feeling the weight of 100 stares on her back. Later that evening, after the ceremonies and the formal dinner and the endless introductions, Emperor Geul called Yuna to his private chamber. The room was dark and warm, lit only by a single floating orb. Her father sat in his chair, a glass of dark wine in his massive hand. You did well today, he said. Thank you, father. You are wondering why we agreed to this, he said. It was not a question. Yuna hesitated, then nodded. He is not what I expected. He is exactly what I expected, Geul said. The humans are clever. They did not send a warrior or a general. They sent a thinker, a reader, a man who learns languages and studies history. He took a sip of wine. That is more dangerous than any soldier, Yuna. Remember that. You want me to watch him, she said. I want you to keep him close. Learn what he knows. Learn what the humans fear, what they want, what they hide. This marriage is not a gift. It is a cage, and you are the keeper. Yuna bowed her head. I understand. She left her father's chamber and walked through the palace corridors toward her own rooms. On the way, she passed a security station and stopped. On one of the screens, she could see the human quarters. Dowan was sitting alone at a small table. He had changed out of his formal uniform into simple clothes. In front of him was a thick book, and she recognized the cover. It was a Velen history text, one of the old ones, written in formal script that even many Velens struggled to read. He was reading it slowly, his finger tracing the lines, his lips moving as he worked through each word. Yuna watched him for a long time. A strange thought came to her, one she could not quite explain. He looked like prey studying the predator, learning its habits, its patterns, its weaknesses. Not out of fear, but out of something else, something patient and deliberate. She shook the thought away and kept walking. In his quarters, Dowan closed the book and rubbed his tired eyes. Taesung, his old military friend and personal guard, sat across from him, cleaning a small sidearm. How bad is it? They think I am a pet, Dowan said. A decoration, something fragile they can put on a shelf and forget about. And? Dowan leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling. Good, he said quietly. Let them think that. The less they expect from me, the more room I have to work. Taesung grinned. You always were the patient one. I did not come here to be fragile, Tae-sun. I came here to build something. And the first step to building anything is making sure nobody tries to stop you before you have laid the foundation. He picked up the book again and opened it to the next page. Outside, the stars turned slowly past the flagship's windows, cold and endless, and full of the kind of silence that only space could hold. Somewhere between two great civilizations, in a room that was not quite his home, a quiet man sat reading, and no one in the Empire understood yet what that meant. The first weeks in the Velen Imperial Palace were a test. Do-won knew this because every inconvenience was too perfect, too carefully placed to be an accident. The food they served him was rich and heavy, filled with minerals and proteins designed for Velen bodies. It sat in his stomach like wet sand. The temperature in his rooms was kept at the Velen standard, which was cold enough to make his breath come out in thin white clouds every morning. The bed was a slab of stone with a thin sheet over it, and the gravity in the palace was set slightly higher than Earth standard, enough to make his legs ache after a full day of walking. He said nothing about any of it. Instead, he adapted. He found the palace kitchens on his third day, and in his quiet, polite way, he made friends with the head cook, a massive Velen woman named Ora, who had served the palace for 40 years. He simply asked her about Velen ingredients, how they were prepared, and what was considered a simple meal. Within a week, Ora was setting aside a small portion of plainer food for him each day, prepared the way he suggested. She told the other servants she did it because it amused her, but the truth was that Do-hwan had listened to her talk about her grandchildren for 2 hours, and no one in the palace had done that in years. For the cold, he sewed extra layers into his clothes, using fabric he traded for with a palace tailor. The tailor, a young Velen named Kisu, was fascinated by the tiny, precise stitches Do-hwan could make with his small human fingers. Velen hands were too large for such fine work. Within days, Kisu was visiting Do-hwan's quarters in the evenings to learn the technique, and the two of them would sit together, sewing and talking about nothing important. For the gravity, Do-hwan simply endured. He walked more slowly. He rested when he needed to. He never complained, and he never let anyone see him struggle. Tae-sun watched all of this and said nothing, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes. Yuna watched too, though she would not have admitted it. She watched from a distance at first, through security feeds and servant reports. She told herself it was her duty, the task her father had given her. But as the days passed, she found herself watching not for intelligence, but out of genuine curiosity. The human was strange. He did not behave the way she expected. She had expected fear. She had expected complaints, demands, or at the very least, the quiet resentment of a man trapped in an unwanted marriage. Instead, Do-won moved through the palace like water moving through rocks, finding every gap, filling every space, going around every obstacle without force or noise. The first real crack in her assumptions came during a court dinner. Prince Hanul, Yuna's elder brother, sat at the head of the table in their father's absence. He was everything Do-won was not. Tall, broad, golden-armored, with a voice that filled rooms and a temper that cleared them. He had made no secret of his hatred for the Alliance, and for the human who now lived in their palace. Halfway through the meal, Hanul stood and lifted a ceremonial blade from the wall behind him. It was an ancient weapon, forged from Velen black iron, and it weighed more than 200 kilograms by human measurement. Hanul held it in one hand like it was made of paper. "Human," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "In the Velen Empire, a husband must be able to protect his wife. Can you lift this blade?" The hall went quiet. Every eye turned to Do-hwan. He looked at the blade. He looked at Hanul. Then he set down his fork, wiped his mouth with a cloth, and spoke in a voice that was calm and clear. I cannot, he said. That blade was made for hands stronger than mine. I was not built to lift swords, Prince Hanu. He paused, and then added, with the smallest trace of a smile, I was built to know when not to. The hall erupted in laughter. Hanu's face twisted, and for a moment, Yuna thought her brother might throw the blade across the table. But the laughter was not all cruel. Some of it was surprised. Some of it was almost impressed, not by strength, but by the sheer nerve of a small, soft creature, sitting in a room full of giants, and refusing to be embarrassed. Hanu sat down. He did not speak for the rest of the dinner, and Yuna noticed something on his face that she had never seen before. Not triumph. Irritation. The irritation of a man who had tried to crush something and found it would not break. The next day, Bo Young arrived. Dowan's younger sister came with a trade delegation, officially to inspect the engineering exchange between human and Velen ships. Unofficially, she came to see her brother. Bo Young was shorter than Dowan, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and she moved through the palace like she owned it, utterly unbothered by the size of the Velens around her. She found Yuna in the training arena and approached her directly. Princess, she said, with a bow that was polite but not deep. I am Bo Young, Dowan's sister. Yuna nodded. I know who you are. Good, then I will be direct. Bo Young crossed her arms. My brother will never complain to you. He will never ask for better treatment. He will never tell you that your people are testing him, insulting him, and trying to break him. He will just keep going, because that is who he is. But I want you to know something. Yuna raised an eyebrow. And what is that? If you think my brother is weak because he is kind, you have already lost. Bo Young turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Yuna stood alone in the arena for a long time after that. Her hands clenched at her sides. She was offended. Who was this tiny human woman to speak to a princess that way? But beneath the offense, something else stirred. A question she could not shake. Lost what, exactly? That evening Yuna trained in the arena. She moved through her combat forms, her body cutting through the air with speed and power that would terrify most species. She knew she was magnificent. She had been told so her entire life. Dowan was there, sitting on a stone bench at the edge of the arena. She had invited him to watch, mostly because she wanted him to see what real strength looked like. He sat quietly through the entire session, his dark eyes following her movements without expression. When she finished, breathing hard, she walked over to him and waited for his reaction. She expected awe, fear, admiration, something. You are very fast, he said, and your power is incredible, but may I ask you something? She frowned. Ask. In your third form, when you shift your weight to strike low, you leave your left side open for almost half a second. Your trainers have not corrected this? Yuna stared at him. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. She had performed that form 1,000 times. Her trainers, the best fighters in the Empire, had watched her do it 1,000 times. None of them had ever noticed. How did you see that? She asked. Dowan shrugged. I watch. It is what I am good at. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her enormous bed, staring at the ceiling, turning the evening over and over in her mind. He was not afraid of her. He was not pretending to be brave. He was not hiding weakness behind false confidence. He simply existed in a way she could not understand, like a puzzle made of pieces that did not fit any shape she knew. He was patient. That was the word that kept coming back to her. And for the first time in her life, Yuna wondered if patience was a kind of strength she had never been taught to recognize.